Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this incredibly well-timed conference. I don't think that David Campbell-Bannerman had inside knowledge when he timetabled this conference for the eve of the budget, but Brexit's in the news. But then again, Brexit's in the news almost every day, so that perhaps is less spectacular in the timing. But my name is Tim Montgomerie, and I'll be chairing today, trying to keep everything as on time as possible so that those of you who've got other things to get onto can get away speedily. Just a few administrative things before we get underway. Those of you who want to tweet, so that people in the outside world can see what's going on, there is free internet access here in the room, and that is, if you haven't found it already, CHW-guests. Once you've logged on to that, you don't need a password or to even leave your email address, and so that should make things a little bit easier. And I have just tweeted a first tweet myself, and I suggest we use the hashtag deal or no deal, just so that we can see what everyone else is saying in the room about what's being said. I'll keep an eye on that hashtag as well, so as when we have opportunity for question and answers, as well as asking people in the room directly, if anything interesting comes up under that hashtag, I'll try and raise that with guests as well. It was 2 years ago, the last time I chaired a David Campbell-Bannerman conference, and that was exploring the options of what might happen if Britain left the European Union. It all felt a lot more, well, it felt very academic then, and I think I said at the end of the conference, I doubt whether we will ever have the opportunity to explore these options in reality. I was not although I was a supporter of Brexit, I was not an optimist about the result. But here we are. It's incredibly real. And we are really fortunate to have such a brilliant lineup of speakers this morning and going on until 1 p.m., including David Davis, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, someone who, of course, was at the heart of campaigning to leave. But we're going to start with Greg Hands, the Trade Minister, who, as well as having that important responsibility and being an MP for Chelsea just down the road, is also MP for London, a Minister for London as well. So he's certainly got a lot on his plate. And you may have noticed on the front page of a certain newspaper last week, certain MPs who were not necessarily towing the government's line with enthusiasm were described as mutineers. Well, Greg if there is an opposite of a mutineer, I think Greg is certainly it. He was a pretty persuasive, in many respects, campaigner for Remain before the EU referendum. But in terms of accepting the result, recognising that the British people had had their say, and putting everything he had into making that judgment work, I think he's an epitome of that commitment. So we're grateful for everything you do, Greg. We're grateful for you coming today, and we look forward to what you've got to say.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you also for the incredibly kind invitation from both you and David. Now, I know Tim is an incredibly prominent fan not only of Brexit, but also of Manchester United. And I always like to rib him gently about this, being the MP for Chelsea, particularly given our relatively recent records in the last decade and a half, or at least since I've been the MP. But one thing I do always say is that I'm personally very glad that Chelsea doesn't change its manager, doesn't change its MP as often as it changes its manager. But it's always an honour to speak here in the Methodist Central Hall. This is a place rich in history, having hosted speeches from the likes of Churchill, Gandhi, and the Dalai Lama. So I'm already building up a little bit of pressure there early in this one. But this place is actually a timeless reminder of how the UK has long been a leading actor during some of the pivotal moments in world history. This hall, or rather the main hall, hosted the first meeting of the United Nations General Assembly in 1946. And if I remember correctly, although of course there's 19 years before I was born, but if I remember my history correctly, in return for use of the Methodist Central Hall, the then custodians of the place managed to convince the UN to repaint the church walls in 1946 after the Blitz and bomb-torn Britain. And I think this is a useful reminder to the naysayers that even when numerically outnumbered, one should never underestimate the ability of a small group of plucky British negotiators to get a good deal. And actually, the paint has even lasted to this day. But I'm also glad to be able to lend my support to the European Conservatives and Reformists, a group I had a small hand in setting up. In the dying years of the last Labour government, I travelled with David Cameron, with William Hague, Mark Francois, and some of our leading MEPs, some of whom are here today, to Brussels, Prague, and beyond to make sure that this group happened and fulfilled David Cameron's pledge to leave the European People's Party. But I realise that today's conference explores the myriad of options of our future relationship with the EU, assessing their advantages and limitations. So my message perhaps goes against the grain of what you'll hear later, because deal or no deal with the EU, the Department for International Trade is ready for any outcome. What the Prime Minister has made clear, both in her Lancaster House and Florence speeches, is that for the first time in over 40 years, Britain will wield its own independent trade policy. And the UK's first dedicated Department for Trade since 1983 is busy getting on with that job. And indeed, it was Gordon Brown who abolished the word trade from government departments altogether in the year 2007. Theresa May has restored trade in every way back to the heart of government where it belongs. So we are approaching the task with equal measures of optimism and pragmatism. Trade policy has long been a competence handed over to the European Union. Reclaiming it opens up an unprecedented level of opportunity, but we first must get the foundations in place. So I'd like to make three main points before taking some questions from the floor. The first foundation, which the Department for International Trade is strengthening, is our core export and investment support. We have brought together trade policy, promotion, and finance all under one roof. This coordination means we can be of greater use to businesses seeking support. Take access to finance, a well-acknowledged inhibitor to exporting, particularly among smaller businesses. UK Export Finance, the government's export credit arm, has seen its risk appetite double to £5 billion and now offers financial backing in over 40 currencies, a real A to Z of global currencies, from the Australian dollar to the Zambian kwacha. Exporters can even access UK financial support during their lunch break through their local high street bank now, thanks to a landmark partnership Liam Fox signed over the summer with the leading banks. While we strengthen trade support at home, we're also leveraging over 3,500 strong trade personnel across 108 countries worldwide, leveraging off our incredibly strong diplomatic network. And this overseas presence will soon be spearheaded by 9 of Her Majesty's Trade Commissioners, which is in the Conservative Manifesto in June. They will be tasked with growing our global commercial footprint, convening export promotion, investment and trade policy on a global regional basis. With the UK already outperforming expectations, they'll be helping to steer a ship that is gaining in momentum. Last year, our total trade as a percentage of GDP grew, slightly contrary to the global trend, reaching almost 60%. Exports to both EU and non-EU countries grew, but the latter, the non-EU part, grew by more than double the amount of the former. And indeed, the trade deficit with the European Union grew from £66 billion in 2015 to £82 billion in 2016. By contrast, exports to non-EU countries are up by over a third since 2010, now making up 57% of our total exports. Europe will always be important for UK business, but we are also seizing the opportunities further afield, and that is important because the IMF predicts that around 90% of world growth is likely to come from outside the EU in the near future. So my second point, and the second foundation we are strengthening, is our trade policy capability. You'll have heard the phrase global Britain used a lot recently, and you'd be forgiven for thinking this is some new concept. Of course, it isn't. Many of the British businesses I speak with are already global by nature. They seek out economic opportunity wherever it lies. As Minister for Trade Policy, I want to make it easier for them to do so. That means deepening trading ties with some of the fastest growing economies around the world. We have working groups with around 20 countries, including China, India, Australia, New Zealand, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and our single largest trading partner, the United States of America. These groups are identifying ways we can push our trading relationship forward, paving the way for future agreements. Much has been made about the number of trade policy experts in the department, though I mentioned earlier that this is a new competence for the UK, or at least a renewed competence from 40 years ago. So our trade policy group has grown significantly since July 2016, making sure we have in place the expertise for our independent trade policy from just 45 personnel in the summer of 2016 to just under 400 today as well. So let me outline some of our initial areas of focus. First, at the World Trade Organization in Geneva, we have to table new independent UK trading schedules, or rectifying our trading schedules to use the trade language, which form the legal basis of our international trading obligations. Now, we see this as a straightforward and technical process. We have seen progress with the UK and the EU, actually, on this case, working cooperatively in managing our transitions in the WTO, covering quotas in agricultural goods, the upper limit on farming subsidies, and our future membership of the government procurement agreement. While the detail will need to be agreed by the WTO membership, this should be seen as a good step forward. Second, we are seeking to replicate the many existing trade agreements the EU has with third countries that we are part of as members of the EU. Now, I heard this decried as a cut and paste exercise, but these are trade agreements that work for this country. There's no reason to not be able to transition these agreements overnight to be UK free trade agreements as we leave the European Union. Maintaining the effects of these arrangements is important if we are to ensure continuity and minimize disruption to businesses, consumers, and our trading partners. Our trade bill, which is currently before Parliament, will enshrine this approach in law, as well as creating powers for the UK to establish an independent trade remedies authority, which will provide a safety net to protect British businesses from unfair trade practices. In short, we are getting on with it, taking the necessary steps to build an independent trading future. And my final point is about a longer-term battle we are facing up to, which I think the UK needs to be at the very centre of. It's an ideological arm wrestle taking place between those who want a global system of free and open trade versus those who are at ease with barriers, be they tariff or non-tariff based. Global trade growth grew slower than global GDP overall last year for the first time since 2001, although our growth was in the opposite direction. In 2010, G7 and G20 countries were estimated to be operating some 300 non-tariff barriers to trade. By 2015, this has ballooned to over 1,200 barriers. That is a quadrupling in just 5 years. Now, Britain is already the global champion that free trade needs. We just need to reclaim our position at the heart of the world trading system. So we will promote, ladies and gentlemen, the benefits of the global free trade system, which we, after all, founded, which eradicates barriers, lowers prices, raises incomes, and boosts standards of living across the developed and developing worlds. OECD analysis suggests that a 10 percentage point increase in trade openness is associated with a 4% increase in income per head. From the phone I just tweeted from before coming on stage to the food in our supermarkets, we all are beneficiaries of a free and open trading system. But this is a cause that the UK government cannot champion on its own. We need businesses both in the UK, across the EU 27, and way beyond to join the call for a more free and fair global rules-based system of trade. I am passionate about that, Liam Fox is passionate about that, the Prime Minister is passionate about that. So in conclusion, the Department for International Trade is getting on with the job of turning the UK into the most passionate advocate for free trade. Set up just over a year ago, we have accomplished so much in such a short space of time. Our work is paving the way towards a brighter, more global future, one where the UK can work with like-minded partners to trade our way to security, stability, and prosperity. Thank you very much. Right, time for some questions.
If people can say where they are from when they ask their question, that would be useful. Is someone, I'll be this.
Do we need a mic? Or?
Just in case.
I'll take Jonathan Isaby from Brexit Central.
Indeed. I hope you all read Brexit Central every day.
I do.
Minister, you obviously spend a lot of your time travelling the world, talking to our potential future trade partners, indeed our continuing trade partners, because we're trading with them already, but there's going to be great opportunities for more trade. I wonder whether you could just share what you hear, because whenever I meet diplomats or politicians from around the world, from outside the EU, I find them incredibly excited about what's happening, indeed far more excited than a lot of the politicians on the opposition benches of the House of Commons, indeed a few of your colleagues on the government back benches. And I just wish we could hear more about that enthusiasm, which I find quite infectious, and I hope would rub off on some of the people in this country who seem determined to be negative about what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. First of all, why don't I pledge to do an interview with Brexit Central to talk about the impressions that I'm getting when travelling on behalf of the Department of International Trade. Well, two things I would say to that. First of all, there is real enthusiasm amongst many, many countries about the UK taking its position in the international trading system in our own right and being a beacon for global free trade. Now, particularly with reference to how one or two others might be retreating from the space of promoting the global rules-based trade system, enthusiasm for the UK coming to occupy part of that space, I think is widely felt. Not just amongst traditional free traders, but also many countries in the developing world who are concerned at some of the anti-trade rhetoric that is now in circulation in parts of the developed world. So genuine enthusiasm for the UK and the Prime Minister's message about being the most passionate and compelling advocate anywhere in the world for global free trade. Secondly, I think the enthusiasm our trading partners and particularly foreign investors have for the UK is undimmed. The reason foreign investors and the reason we are the #1 market in Europe for foreign direct investment, incredibly important for creating and preserving jobs in this country and our livelihoods, the #1 reason is that the UK is fundamentally a good country in which and with which to do business. They like our low tax regimes, they like our transparent regulatory systems, our predictable systems of rules, and our free market approach to the overall economy. That is something which fundamentally, if you go out, and I've spent a lot of time talking to anybody from US tech companies through to large Chinese investors, big Japanese companies, that is ultimately what attracts them to the UK. let's just park Brexit for a moment. The fundamentals of the way that we run our economy is actually the most attractive aspect for foreign investors coming into the UK. So just since the Brexit vote, we've seen major announcements from big US companies. We've seen major announcements from the likes of Siemens. We've seen major announcements from big Japanese companies. We've seen major announcements for the Chinese as well, investing in this country. And that is a very, very strong message that we send as we seek to preserve our position as the #1 destination for foreign direct investment. So I think both on the free trade space and on the investment space, the UK wins out. And we need to fight to make sure that continues to be the case.
Just noticed a few people stood at the back, and there's a few single seats. If you're not having to escape at an early point, would you mind just bunching up a little bit? I think every chair is going to be used, and it would be just good to have everyone sat down comfortably. Okay, so Ricky's now got the microphone. So, Owen there, please. And I'm seeing lots of male hands. It'd be nice to have a female voice soon in a minute. So there we are.
Hello, Owen Bennett from HuffPost. And if you're dishing out interviews, we'll gladly have one with you on HuffPost, if that's okay.
Let me think about it, yeah?
Thank you.
Not so readily agreed to.
No.
Well,
there might be Crawford Faulkner, who is, of course, one of the top negotiators in the Department of International Trade, seemed to cast some doubt on whether or not some of the existing trade deals the EU had could be cut and pasted to the UK. He told the Select Committee, I've been around negotiations a lot, and what people say today sometimes changes tomorrow. Are you worried that some of those trade deals with countries like South Korea, Israel, for example, won't be copied over as soon as Brexit happens?
no, I'm not, because all of the major ones have agreed to do this. None of those partners has yet said that they won't do it. Of course, there are 40 plus of these agreements, some of which are much more useful than others. So, of course, there isn't a guarantee that we're going to get all 40 plus of these agreements transitioned, but I am very confident, and Crawford is very confident, that we will be in a very, very good space to make sure that these become UK FTAs. It's strongly in our common interest. The European Commission knows that we are doing this. Our partners are, just last week I was met with all of the Caribbean trade ministers. Before I go too far into that, Tim, I ought to point out it wasn't an opportunity to go to the Caribbean. I met them, as it turns out, in Brussels, but that's a good example. Here we're transitioning our preference arrangements for Caribbean countries, a really big issue in this country as well. Actually, the Caribbean diaspora here is watching this very, very closely. And here we get an agreement. I signed an agreement afterwards with the 15 members of the CARIFORUM to transition that agreement. So I think this is in a good place. It's strongly in our interest. It's strongly in their interests. And it makes it a lot easier to do this, ensuring continuity for business. And it's also enshrined in the trade bill that we're currently taking through the House of Commons.
Okay, gentleman there. Still no ladies' hands. The first lady to put their hand up will get the question. Thank you. Remember, please, to state your name.
Thank you. It's Myrig Raymond, President of the National Farmers Union. Thank you, Minister. From a farming perspective, you talked about rules of trade, freer trade, and I've had excellent working relationships with Michael Gove and Owen Paterson before. It was fascinating reading Owen Paterson this morning in the Telegraph, where he was talking about reducing bureaucracy, freer trade, the Minford line. And then I hear Michael Gove talk about maintaining the standards of production that we have been used to through the European Union. In fact, he's even talking about enhancing those standards. How can British farmers be competitive if we are going to have that enhanced standards of production, and on the second hand, we're going to let cheaper food into the UK, whether it's chlorinated washed chicken, hormone-treated beef, and so forth? Because this is going to be a huge debate. Which side of the sort of argument are you on, Minister?
Okay. Let me try and take that question head on, and it's a very well put question. Really, there's two elements to this. There's the element of maintaining our own food standards, and then there's looking at the opportunities abroad for UK exports in your sector. First of all, we are absolutely committed to maintaining our already high food and animal welfare standards. We describe it as a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. And we are absolutely committed, Liam Fox, Michael Gove, the Prime Minister, all of us, to making sure that that remains the case. Secondly, I think on the opportunity, if I'm not mistaken, food and drink is one of the UK's fastest growing export sectors, if not the fastest growing, depending on how exactly you define that. And I think the potential, like for example, if you look at CETA at the moment, which has got amazing potential for UK food and drink to be exported into Canada. And that is not just the more obvious Scotch whisky. There's fantastic opportunities for British farmers through British cheese and other produce being exported into Canada. And I think that your members can rest assured that we will be maintaining our food, animal welfare standards, everything else, whilst at the same time giving you and your members an excellent opportunity to be able to sell your produce and your services abroad.
Very briefly,
On cheaper imports, sorry. The concern is we're going to end up in a freer market, and we're going to be importing product that's been sort of produced around the world to much lower standards, whether it's Mercosur or whether it's the US, and that's the big concern, and we then lose our competitiveness.
Well, again, I would look at the facts on the ground. I mean, let's say, take an example like New Zealand lamb, for example. New Zealand lamb doesn't use up its current quota to the EU 28. I don't think there's a special need to be nervous about non-EU farm produce coming into the country. We have said very specifically that on the standard side, we will fight to maintain those standards. You'll be aware, and I'm sure keenly following the debate in Geneva on how we divvy up the tariff rate quotas between the EU and the UK. And you'll be aware of the position being taken by other countries, and I'll make sure that Liam and I keep you posted, and Michael Gove, as to how those negotiations proceed in terms of who gets what on the tariff rate quota, which I know will be of interest to your members. And we are absolutely committed to continuing our dialogue with the NFU and everybody involved in the sector, talking about both the challenges and the opportunities that the future will bring to British farming.
Has there been, we obviously haven't left the European Union yet, but Europe has observed our decision. Has there been any noticeable effect from European consumers buying less British goods in any area?
I haven't seen that, but I think it's something that we do keep an eye on. And I've certainly not seen, judging from those the trade surplus the EU has with us, any reverse effect. I see no reason why that should be the case. But I think if that were the case, and I've got people dotted obviously around Europe keeping a close eye on how UK goods and services exports are progressing. And I think if they were to see that, if they saw that was the case, I'm sure I would be one of the first to know about it. I'm not saying it won't happen, but I'm not aware so far that we've seen any kind of reluctance to buy British as a result of the vote on the 23rd of June 2016.
Thank you.
Sarah Macken from Airbus. The recent election, one of the outcomes of it was the recognition that a lot more younger people were interested in politics and voting. And they are the group that are somewhat sceptical about Brexit. So how do you think the benefits of free trade and the positive elements of Brexit can be sold to younger voters?
Yeah, well, I think actually the answer is in your question, Sarah. You're right, younger people did vote more for Remain than for Leave, but younger people are also more globalist and more open, I believe, to free trade. So I think free trade is part of one of the key ways that we can sell Britain's future outside of the European Union to those younger generations. And I think I'm always impressed by, when I was a younger person, let me just be careful how I phrase that, but I went and I worked in Germany for 6 months in the summer of 1985, which was quite a radical thing to do in 1985. Now I think a lot of our younger people actually look much more globally than perhaps my generation did. I think these days going to work in Germany for 6 months between school and university might be regarded as being slightly timid. Compared to what a number of young people get up to doing voluntary work and other things on a much more global basis. So I think we should use free trade in the trade agenda and also actually the international development agenda, which we haven't talked about yet. But I'm immensely proud the fact that this government is the first UK government to spend 0.7% of gross national income on international development. And I think we should be looking at both trade and development as a way of selling a more global Britain.
Gentleman there, where's the microphone? Ricky, just come there, please.
I think it's Ahmed Bashir, isn't it? Yes, yeah.
Yeah, MEP for Yorkshire and the Humber. Minister, do you not agree that Brexit gives us a huge opportunity now that the United States is retracting and going away from international trade for us to play a part in the development in the third world, especially countries like Pakistan, where I was born, which has been affected by a 40-year war next door in Afghanistan? It gives huge opportunities for Britain to trade with these countries so they can trade their way out of trouble and trade their way into prosperity.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Ahmed. And actually, I was in Pakistan only about 2 months ago, first trade minister to visit there for some years. And that was precisely my message, that the UK is going to be back on the world stage as a promoter of free trade and occupying a big, important space at the WTO and beyond as being a beacon for free trade. And that landed very well in Pakistan. Also, I announced the fact that we were going to be transitioning the preferences scheme for Pakistan such that their goods have got preferential access to the UK market. That's very important for our existing trade relations with Pakistan. But Pakistan is a classic case of a market with enormous potential. I mean, 207 million people, a growing middle class of 40 to 50 million people, growing in prosperity. Some of our UK companies got major operations there. GSK has got one of its largest factories anywhere in the world, pumping out 200 million packages of medicine for the Pakistan market each year. And actually, there's immense opportunities out there. And I think that you and I can work together to make sure that, and others in this room, to make sure that we take advantage of those opportunities in countries like Pakistan, which I think are crying out for more UK leadership in the global trading system.
And final question will have to be from my former Times colleague, Matt Ridley, House of Lords. Don't know whether the Telegraph's had a couple of mentions. We should definitely give the Times some publicity. Matt's column in the Times on Monday is one of the essential reads every week on what we used to call Fleet Street. So
too much build-up, Tim. Minister, have you had any success in dissuading the Treasury from pursuing the gravity model of trade, i.e. the idea that trade is inversely dependent on distance from another country these days?
Well, I think I'm not going to get down too deep into Treasury models. I seem to recall that Treasury models aren't always so popular in different parts of the country. But what I will say is that actually we are working very closely with Treasury. Treasury are very supportive of providing the funds for our department to make sure that our footprint is correct as we reposition ourselves with our own independent trade policy overall. And I think the Treasury is also, you can have some fantastic negotiations and dialogue with Treasury in terms of how trade works. There's a deep understanding within the Treasury of how trade will work, and actually I think we do see eye to eye on both the need to maintain our existing trading relations with the European Union, which after all is still 43% of our exports, while still being able to take advantage of all of the opportunities beyond the EU. So on both those, the Department for International Trade and the Treasury are totally at one. Thank you.
Former Treasury Minister speaks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you all very much indeed.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Tim, distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Thank you firstly for coming to my ECR-sponsored conference today, which is an illustration of how our work in the European Parliament and that of individual nations intertwines. As a pro-Brexit MEP who campaigned vigorously for my own redundancy, I see it as my role in life now to try and facilitate the best deal we can for both the UK and the EU in the short time we have left. We need to assist the process of changing our relationship from membership of the EU to one of very close partners cooperating daily on trade, economics, foreign affairs, politics, counter-terrorism and security. We too, what Monsieur Barnier called yesterday, a most ambitious trade deal with the UK. The conference was timed to fall just before the vital December EU Council Summit of Leaders and its vital preparatory papers, which will decide on whether sufficient progress has been made on money, EU citizens and the Northern Ireland border to start negotiating a trade deal. It aims to look at the trade models available once and if we get to negotiating a trade relationship between the UK and the EU, from the deal side as well as from the no-deal side. I think by the end of the year, we'll know whether Britain will be heading for deal or no deal. But of course we mean no trade deal, but not no deals at all. In reality, as with Canada, there are a number of deals to be struck, such as on aviation, data, investment, customs, immigration perhaps. Remember that if there is no trade deal, we can still negotiate to conclude these kind of non-trade deals. But we must all think carefully if we want 30 to 40% tariffs on French or British cheeses, 45% tariffs on meat, 10% tariffs on nearly 900,000 German cars, or 12% tariffs on wine from France, Italy or Spain. Civitas, I think they're here today, they estimate if tariffs return, the UK will be paying $5 billion in tariff compensation, but the UK will be paying $13 billion, and that money comes to London, not Brussels. Now, having spent 10 years on the Trade Committee of the European Parliament, I've worked on deals like Canada, the Indian Free Trade Agreement, the forthcoming New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. I've just come back from there, meeting a lot of trade bodies, and on Colombia, Peru, South Korea, and Japan. I have some knowledge and insight, hopefully, into the kind of trade deals the EU does and how it actually does them. As a keen Brexiteer, I always knew that Brexit would actually boil down to trade and the nature of a trade deal, and I've tried to learn as much as possible about these in my time. Now, the brief from the British government is a new deep and special partnership and a comprehensive trade deal. I have to say an apology, first of all, that trade deals can be very complex, very technical, detailed, and pretty dull. There are often a whole list of chapters, protocols, and annexes linked to a whole number of other legalese and other agreements. This is a lawyer's paradise. But bear with me, because cracking this lies at the very heart of Brexit talks and our future relationship with the EU. It is why we are in full negotiation on the cash needed to meet our obligations. We seek to conclude a trade deal with the EU, once again, as a free, sovereign and independent nation, rather like Canada and its new relationship with the EU and New Zealand and Australia, where negotiations are about to start. All three of those countries are English-speaking, Queen-admiring, English law-abiding, free-trading and cricket-playing nations. All self-governing, but want to have friendly and close trade and political cooperation with the EU. But all roads do lead to trade. Our Prime Minister rightly said in Florence that she does not want to see, quote, a stark and unimaginative choice between two models, either something based on the EEA membership or a traditional free trade agreement, such as the EU has recently negotiated with Canada. She called the Canada deal the most advanced free trade agreement the EU has yet concluded and a breakthrough in trade between Canada and the EU. But she rightly caveated it by saying, compared with what exists between Britain and the EU today, it would nevertheless represent a restriction on our mutual market access that it would benefit neither of our economies. Not only that, it would start from the false premise that there's no pre-existing regulatory relationship between us. She also called for Renaissance-style creativity So this gives us the parameters to which we must work. In this section, I want to present to you in some detail a proposed model of association I call Super Canada, which may not sound like Florentine's David, but is indeed based on that recently agreed Canada-CETA deal, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, but which is wider, deeper, and better, importantly including far more on services than for Canada, and particularly on financial services. By the way, please don't buy the propaganda that it took 7 years to negotiate. Negotiations were actually 3 years, with 4 years wasted on rows over human rights and investor protection. Canada had 16,500 goods tariffs to get rid of alone during these negotiations, though many were zero-rated. But Britain starts from a very different place. We have no tariffs to negotiate away. We have no quotas to end or laws to converge. The repeal bill will actually make all EU laws UK laws. But before discussing trade, I just want to point to the companion to the trade deal, rather like Jupiter following the moon, which is the non-trade political agreement that goes hand in hand with the CETA trade deal. And this is called the Strategic Partnership Agreement, or SPA. The SPA covers cooperation on aspects such as justice, security, defense, counterterrorism, foreign affairs, common democratic values, cooperation in multilateral organizations like the United Nations, and sustainable development. I call them MAPs, that is, motherhood and apple pie deals, because they're pretty non-controversial. It's a kind of agreement mirrored in the EU-Australian Framework Agreement, signed in August this year by the EU, and the new EU-New Zealand PARC Agreement, that's the Partnership Agreement on Relations and Cooperation, which I and the European Parliament, and there's many MEPs here today, who voted through last week. In my view, these are all useful templates for a EU-UK political agreement, our own strategic partnership agreement. These have, for example, an institutional framework of close international cooperation, including technical committees for regulatory cooperation and joint committees or joint ministerial committees, where experts, ministers or prime ministers can continue to meet. So SPA is a good template for a non-trade political deal. Turning now then to the trade side, let me just put it in context, if I may. Firstly, the EU does trade deals, but it works within a much larger rules-based system established by the WTO, the World Trade Organization, with its 164 members and observers. Now, Britain is a member of the WTO in its own right and will regain its place on its powerful technical committees, as the Minister so ably said earlier. The WTO describes itself as a forum for governments to negotiate trade agreements. In short, the WTO is a spring that feeds into the rivers of trade deals worldwide, including all the EU trade deals. The agreements made by the WTO are incorporated into these EU trade agreements. So, for example, in the CETA deal, you will see the WTO's General Agreement on Trade and Services, that's GATS, and that pops up in CETA as Chapter 9. It's the WTO, not the EU, which sets the simple fundamental principles, as the WTO puts it, that are the foundation of the multilateral trading system. Do not forget, any trade deal really is about the WTO. That's the framework. The EU and UK as WTO members must follow its rules, guidance, and agreements in whatever trade deal we do end up doing, and it has its own court or appellate body, as with the non-ending Airbus and Boeing subsidy disputes, and I think Airbus is here today, so sympathy to that. Any free trade agreement between the EU and UK will have to have WTO approval. And you have to remember, an FTA is a licensed form of discrimination. It actually gives better terms than allowed under the most favoured nation. You've probably heard MFN terms. As those rules state, you can give no more favourable terms to another WTO member unless through an FTA. So you have to ensure that 90% of tariffs are removed in general. The EU has 4 types of trade deals: the old basic first-generation agreements, the deep and comprehensive free trade areas like Ukraine, It has economic partnership agreements, EPAs, which give access to the single market to countries like Africa, developing nations. And fourthly, and most relevantly to us, is the new generation or modern deals, which cover Colombia, Peru, Singapore, South Korea, and Canada. The reality on trade deals is you don't have unlimited choices. While the UK does want a bespoke deal, the main templates to draw from are limited, as we'll see at this conference. We have the EEA option, and Helle Hagenau from Norway is going to speak about that, used by Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. The Swiss option, which is touching on that as well. The Turkish goods custom option. The Ukraine option, which sadly contributed to starting a war, which is not a good recommendation. And then there is a no deal that is actually a deal, that is WTO rules, because WTO rules is an arrangement, but it's not a free trade agreement, it's not an agreement. The EU is asking, perhaps reasonably, which one of these we actually want, which brings me to Canada. Now, Canada's CETA is a great deal, and I helped get it through the Parliament and met President Trudeau, Justin Trudeau. It's interesting, the Canadian government describes this as a progressive free trade agreement which covers virtually all sectors and aspects of Canada-EU trade in order to eliminate or reduce barriers. Prior to CETA's entry into force, only 25% of EU tariff lines of Canadian goods were duty-free. Upon CETA's entry into force, the EU will remove tariffs on 98% of its tariff lines. And once CETA is fully implemented, the EU will have eliminated tariffs on 99% of its tariff lines. And this is in contrast, the Canada is the 12th largest trading partner with the EU. Britain is the largest single trading partner of the rest of the EU 27. So let's just start briefly with what the EU regards as good about CETA and its own publicity. It sees it as modern, comprehensive, a gold standard deal is how they describe it, and it sees it actually summarizes it as leveling the playing field on the Canadian market for EU companies. That's how it sees free trade agreements. It eliminates tariffs, as I said, on all industrial products, over 2/3 of tariffs on fishing and 90% on agricultural goods. And it doesn't require Canada to make a financial contribution, as Andrew Neil pointed out the other day. There's no free movement in CETA, as there's none in NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement either. But it does allow for transfers of company staff and other professionals on a temporary basis, for architects, for example, and bankers, as David Davis mentioned just to the Germans just this week. This section is related to Mode 4 of the WTO's Service Agreement, GATS. And on standards, CETA will not change EU standards, it boasts this. It related to food safety, product safety, consumer protection, health, environment, social and labour standards. They will remain untouched, is what the EU says. And it eliminates, it helps with double testing, as it's called. So they accept each other's conformity assessment certificates on things like electrical goods and machinery and toys. It's the most far-reaching agreement ever concluded in the area of services and investment. It's not true that there's nothing on services in CETA, there's quite a lot. And it opens up postal, telecommunications, maritime markets, and public procurement, not just at federal level, but in the provinces. And on IP, on intellectual property, it protects copyright, pharmaceutical and other properties, and geographical indicators. The EU loves these things, GIs, to protect Roquefort cheese or champagne or Parma ham or balsamic vinegar, all of which we all consume here in great quantities, of course. And it has a mutual recognition of professionals for architects, accountants, engineers. There's a long list. I mean, basically say if you're qualified in Canada, you can work in the EU. And that's something we definitely would want to see in a UK deal. Just to finish up then on Canada, the EU likes CETA as a trade model. CETA is the basis for a deal with both New Zealand and Australia. This is hot news, it's just happening. I've been told that the New Zealand deal will actually take on board 80% of CETA without much issue, and the other 20% will be negotiable. Australia too is using the CETA template, and the EU encourages this. Now, I know that lawyers are sometimes uncomfortable with the notion of templates, as this may distract from large fees. But the reality is that trade deals around the world have a great element of templates built in, and the ingredients are much the same. Those WTO agreements I touched on are turned into chapters in these deals, and it's very relevant also to turn existing EU trade deals like South Korea into bilateral UK deals post-Brexit, as the Trade Minister made clear. So, dare I say, there's quite an element of cut and paste to these deals. So what I call Super Canada, or some call CETA Plus, or CETA Plus Plus, or even CETA Plus Plus Plus, takes the bespoke deal closer to EEA, the European Economic Area, which Norway has. It might be a case of EEA minus, minus, minus. But the point is there is continuing here between CETA on the one hand and the EEA on the other. And we need a deal that lies somewhere between those two, which goes much further, deeper and wider than Canada. Now, ladies and gentlemen, just to wind up with a few bits of detail, I'm putting on my website now at 11 o'clock, well, my designer is, I'm not doing it here personally, but it's a paper, a detailed paper that compares CETA with what I call Super Canada, and what needs to change and what doesn't need to change. Very briefly in the details, 12 out of the 30 chapters in CETA would need hardly any change at all. Of the other 18, most need minor changes, but 7 would need substantial writing, and I think this is important. In electrical communications and data protection, because we're much closer to the EU on that area, we might need a separate data deal. Government procurement, we might want to protect the NHS, that's a political issue. Intellectual property, geographical indicators, as I say, the EU is very keen on that and wants that in the British deal. Regulatory cooperation, this came up with Mr. Barnier again yesterday. He's worried that we'll go off and become like Singapore. It's not the case, but you can have regulatory committees that assess how divergent you're becoming of regulation. And then there's sanctions on trade and sustainable development, which I do oppose. They're trying to do it to New Zealand and Australia, where basically if the EU thinks that Britain is not actually fulfilling environmental obligations, then they can fine us or reoppose tariffs. Bilateral cooperation and dialogues, that's where we put EU programs we want to stay in, like Horizon 2020, I'd recommend, the research program and Erasmus for students, and EU agencies such as the European Space Agency, we might want to stay in. Finally, the speed of the agreement, if you take investment out of it and investment protection, and someone here has already mentioned the dreaded ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement, which brought down the TTIP deal, if you remember the American deal. If you take that out, which is what the EU is proposing to do on New Zealand and Australia, then actually the EU itself can actually agree this trade deal. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very quick run through the existing Canada-CETA deal and how it can serve as a template for the wider, bigger and better Super Canada deal I propose, including services. I do believe that Super Canada is attractive, deliverable and positive for all, and I recommend it to you today. Thank you.
So 5-10 minutes of questions. Who would like to ask David first? You're so enthusiastic.
There's a lawyer, I think.
Are you?
Very fine lawyer.
Please, thank you.
David's actually Mr. Remember, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a company secretary and a pension.
Our company secretary.
My name is Charles Pender. I wanted to ask about the dispute resolution under this that you think there would be, because clearly it's one of the great sort of mantras of the EU that they want to keep the ECJ involved in things, and they want to have sort of their rules, and and obviously that comes across many different areas. But as far as trade is concerned, I suppose the first question is, what's the mechanism with Canada, and do you see that as being a difficult area of negotiation, and specifically on the trade side?
No, well, thank you. As I say, it's what caused the collapse of the US-EU trade deal, TTIP. There was a lot of opposition, investor-state dispute settlement, and the fact, you could force, private companies could force through, private hospitals, for example. There was, the NHS was a major component in that. My understanding is investment settlement procedures could be taken out of the agreement altogether, this actual trade agreement, and dealt with a separate investment agreement. And this is what's being proposed at the moment, because the EU, the ECJ decision on the Singapore trade deal says that basically, whether we like it or not, if you don't have investor protection, then the rest of the trade deal can be dealt with by the European Parliament and the Council, etc., which speeds everything up because you have up to 10 years. Like Canada could take 10 years to be finally ratified. It's happening, but it needs 10 years of ratification. Canada has a better system than the TTIP does. It has an ICS, an international court settlement system of arbitration. I think I'd have something similar, but I think a lot of this depends on whether you have that in the trade deal at all. But, it shouldn't be the ECJ, I would say that. That's the bottom line. It's not the ECJ. You have to have EFTA has its own court. Canada has its own court. I think it has to be something that is neutral with, and frankly, there aren't many cases anyway, but it does have to be something that's neutral.
You were, Ricky.
Yeah, I could have stayed there.
Good for you.
Hi, I'm Alice. I work in Parliament. I had a question kind of related.
Which one?
For William Ragg, MP for Hazelgrove. My question was relating to Heidi Allen yesterday in the Public Accounts Committee. She was berating other MPs for basically being a bit pessimistic about trade and saying about how their expectation is that the day after we leave, whether that's the 29th, 30th of March or whatever, the trade is going to be the same amount. With your experience, what are your kind of forecasts? What are your expectations? And also, how do you think the UK government rhetoric is being received in Europe as well?
No, thank you. It's a good question. Firstly, I mean, it is clear, I think, legally, we will lose the trade deals the EU has, like South Korea, because they're with the EU, not Britain as an independent member. So we'd have to rapidly replace them. But as I say, I've mentioned cut and paste without being cynical. We want the same deal. We are a party to that deal now. And it's clear that South Korea and others like Canada want a replacement deal. So bilaterals are entirely possible. I would say one of the key points, from my experience in the Trade Committee, the EU is not even starting negotiations with China. It's paused it on India. I meant to be writing a report on India, but nothing's happened. There are very big economies. US, US Embassy is well represented here today. Great. We want a free trade deal with the US. We can move very rapidly on this. And again, the lawyers argue, but we can scope out these deals. The EU scoping deals is the first stage. We're actually scoping the British deal now. That's the first stage. We can get on with that. We just can't sign them or technically negotiate them whilst we're still a member. But, there's a great global trading world out there. And you just go to New Zealand, little country, 4.5 million, one of the greatest exporters in the world. So.
Stephen. Let me take it from you then.
Don't want to heart today. He works for me.
Thank you. David, as a fellow... Stephen Wolfe, fellow MEP. As a fellow Brexit traveller and soon-to-be unemployed MEP.
Yeah.
On the deal or no deal, and in the European Parliament, are we not beginning to realise from our conversations with MEPs that if the current negotiations that are going on lead us to actually having no trade deal, whether it's Super Canada, as you suggest, or otherwise, then the European Union countries are beginning to realise how costly it would be. For example, you're going to talk about and explain the MFN costs that would increase their top-end products. And after all, most European products are at the top end in the 100 billion. But also, as many in the city have told us, that the currency of the UK would drop from, say, 0.88 to even going to €1.10, which could increase the cost of European products up to 20%.
Yeah.
If they have those costs at 20%, and we have deals with the rest of the world, does it not become the case that Europe loses out in billions whilst trade with the rest of the world becomes cheaper here, and our exports to the rest of the world increase as well?
Yes, no, thank you, Stephen. And yes, WTO rules an interesting one. I mean, when I was in New Zealand, I was actually sampling some wine in Marlborough, the Marlborough wine area, and I said to them, you realise that if we go to WTO rules, Britain does, French wine will go up 12%, as will Italian wine, for example. Whilst we do a quick New Zealand free trade agreement as a UK, it could come down 12%. So there's a differential of 24% on wine. It's very popular in Britain. So you're absolutely right. There could be some major changes. And of course, you know, do we need to charge 45% tariffs on New Zealand lamb? I look at the NFU here very nervously, but actually, I did ask a lot of questions protecting our farmers. I'm from the east of England. I look after my farmers. But, you know, the point is lambing is 6 months apart. I mean, there's geographic need. Now, chill meat is only like 3 months, so there's a bit of overlap, but actually a lot of it is helping our markets. And a lot of it's going to the Far East from New Zealand anyway. So I think opening up the markets can actually be of huge benefit, and we can see consumer prices dropping, which is a major advantage out of this. So even no deal is better than what we have now.
Final quick question, quick answer.
We better, yeah.
Squeeze it in, please.
Yeah.
David, it's Caroline Stevens, formerly of Vote Leave. I'd just like to ask, you mentioned Mode 4. Now, from the TTIP negotiations, Mode 4 actually works adversely against the British population because of the language.
It's easier, yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to end up with more people coming in to our country to work. Is everybody aware of that?
I think you have to be careful in Mode 4, because Mode 4 is, I mean, it's under World Trade Organization, Mode 4. It's separate from the immigration policy, but we'd have to decide what immigration policy is first. But Mode 4 allows temporary workers on their own, not families, etc., generally coming in, where there's shortages or where there's high skills needs. It's pretty limited. And it would be our choice as the UK to decide how much that is, how many people come in. I mean, David Over's mentioned bankers, you know, allowing maybe a couple of thousand bankers more to come around. Well, it's not going to break the bank. I mean, it's not going to actually have a huge difference. It's not mass immigration. You can have immigration control, but under Mode 4, you have very limited, controlled, temporary workers coming in. I don't think, I mean, to be honest, if you look at the numbers, it's not a huge difference. And it's all negotiable anyway. You know, if that's a very sensitive area, it may be something we don't want to push. But I wouldn't be afraid of it. You're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people. You're talking about 10,000 maybe, something like that, 10, 20,000 at most.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me at the outset say that I have been a Remainer, and I have, on the other hand, always supported the British government's position, that is to accept the British vote. And I have myself given a couple of speeches in the European Parliament, blasting the arrogance of people like Verhofstadt and the impression which Mr. Barnier gave that he wanted to sort of punish the British people for their vote. On the other hand, I am still a Remainer, and I must say that I have great respect to David that he has invited me. I know that he knows that he takes a risk when inviting me. I hope it's a calculated risk. I'd like to tell you that yesterday, together with two other previous chairman of the German Federation of Industries, which is the equivalent of the CBI, and a couple of other senior German businessmen, we announced a major drive in Berlin. And this call was a call for a new deal for Britain. And this drive was addressed and is addressing not London, it is addressing Brussels. And the aim is to start Brussels thinking about a new deal for Britain to avoid Brexit. So I know that doesn't really fit into the subject of this conference. And I will from now on just talk about what happens if we are not successful. So deal or no deal. Let me tell you at the outset, the BDI has about 150,000 companies as members, and I don't know of one which wants Brexit, not one. So the situation and the idea and the opinion of the German industry is quite clear. If I was asked to summarize my position to this conference in one sentence, I would say the following. I would say that we need the best deal possible for Britain, comma, and that will also be the best deal for Germany, full stop. That really is my bottom line. And let me give you 3 reasons why Germany is very interested in having a very good trade deal for Britain. But it needs a trade deal. Number 1, we are depending also on the British economy. You are our 3rd largest customer. And quite frankly, despite what we all heard here this morning, we are worried. We knew that you were, before Brexit, on number 1 amongst the G7, and now you're at the bottom. And the German car industry is registering at the moment 20% less sales in the UK, which is about the same kind of drop as we had when the financial crisis broke out here. So we are interested in a good trade deal for Britain. Number 2, and that is worrying us even more. Let us not forget, Britain is in the EU since over 40 years. And that has had its impact on German, and I suppose also on British companies. This is not a new trade deal where new relations are being developed. This is a situation where relations are existing. And if we have a deal which breaks these supply and logistical chains between British companies and companies in the EU, then we are in deep trouble. So it is of interest to German companies and French companies and British companies to have the best deal possible. As a matter of fact, in my definition, the best deal would be one that nothing changes, that we continue to treat you as if you never left. That is in the interest of German industry, and I suppose of all of Europe's industry. And quite frankly, if it wasn't for the motive to set an example, opening brackets, punish the British for the vote, closing brackets, that should be of the interest to all of Europe. So that is number 2. And these supply chain, I cannot give you all the details because I don't have the time, problems are significant. We are hearing them from major companies, not only BMW and so on, and Ford and Honda, but others. And I can give you plenty of examples of what will happen if we don't get a trade deal. Just give you one little figure. Honda believes that it costs them £1 million a year if their trucks are being held up only by 15 minutes more during 1 year. And and the enormous bureaucracy of getting an engine which has been produced in Britain and put it into a Ford Fiesta in Germany is also enormous, 20,000 different documents every month. So, and the last reason why I think we should have a very good deal, in my opinion, the best thing the EU has ever achieved is the common market. Some of you, and I tend to agree with you, could also say maybe that's the only good thing the EU has ever achieved. But why has it been such a great achievement? It has been achieved because the market has become bigger and bigger. And if the market becomes bigger and bigger, more efficiency is made available to the various industries in those countries, to the benefit of the consumers, of course. Now, with Brexit, that is not going to happen. That's why we need that deal. So let me finally say, even a Remainer like I say, for Christ's sake, yes, no Brexit is my preference, and no deal is the worst. So let's shoot if no Brexit doesn't work, and that's up to you, not up to us. If no Brexit does not work, we must make sure we have the best deal possible. And here I would like to absolutely say that what David Campbell-Bannerman just said is, I think, the right approach. The best deal possible I know of would be one which is sort of more or less tailored towards Canada. So let me finalize my little remark here. It is for me we regret Britain leaving. We really regret it. And I give you two reasons why we regret it, which have nothing to do with economies. One reason is just an example. When the British deputies leave the parliament, 73 I guess you have, deputies leave with common sense. And you know what happens? They have decided to distribute those empty seats across those countries which have not left, which is, I think is atrocious. And by the way, none of those seats will go to Germany because we already have hit the maximum ceiling of 96. So the influence of non-market oriented, if you wish, socialist tendencies is going to dramatically rise in the European Parliament when you go. And the second reason is really, I regret that you are the only country with common sense left. Please stay. Thank you.
For our mutual relationship, but you haven't held back in telling us and really conveying your regrets at the decision that people took. So thank you for that, and thank you for being generous with your time. Gentleman there. I've got the mic.
Raymond Cade from Bexley and Battle Conservative constituency. Could I ask you, what pressure or influence can you make on the EU negotiators as a representative of German industry?
Well, I think quite a lot. If you see what we just announced yesterday, asking the German government to lean on Brussels to provide them with a new deal, we blasted at the same time the European Union for two things. Not only for the way Monsieur Barnier is sort of handling the negotiations, because I think we said that they're unlogical. I'll give you two reasons. The European Union wants from your Prime Minister a price. Well, look, before the European Union is willing to negotiate on trade. Now, if you go into a shop, you don't name a price without knowing what you're going to get for it. So I think it should be enough if your Prime Minister says, we will fulfill our financial obligations, full stop. That should be enough. And if a French commissioner doesn't accept it, I think it's insulting an entire nation. The other reason which I give you is in this condition it is said that she is asked to come up with a solution to the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Well, how is it possible without knowing what kind of a trade deal you have? This is impossible. I don't know of any border regime in the world which doesn't have an assumption of what kind of trade and customs deal you have. So this whole thing is totally unlogical. And finally, when you see our announcement, we don't blame Britain. Actually, we blame Brussels for Brexit for two reasons. Number one, and I have followed that very well. You joined a European Union of sovereign nations, and suddenly somebody decided to make the United States of Europe out of it. Now, I heard a lot about football this morning. Here I'm
who do you support?
well, Hamburg, but my club is unfortunately only on the fourth last place, so it's not too good at the moment. However, Liverpool is run by a German coach, so I might, with the usual German modesty, I might say this here. But I'd like to make this point. It was Brussels, but if you join a football club and the club management decides to play golf, then I ask who has left whom. It is Brussels who changed the rules of the game. And you reacted to the changes in Brussels. And I think that is very clear. And number two, I remember very well the debate during the last weeks of the Brexit referendum in this country. and I noticed what kind of an impact the immigration policy of Europe had. I mean, Mrs. Merkel let more than 1 million people in, mostly without passports, not knowing where they came from, not knowing what they wanted. And she said, look, they will get one day integrated, and then they will get a German passport. By the way, they will probably never really speak German. And the next stage is one day they may show up in London. I have some appreciation for that situation. So here you see how European policy, in my view, actually was the reason for Brexit and triggered it.
While we have you, while we have you here, obviously your own country is going through a little bit of political turmoil itself at the moment. And not asking the question, I don't want you to talk about the implications of what's going on in your country for Brexit. We haven't, just interested in full stop in what your assessment is of Angela Merkel's future and
Yes.
what you think the likeliest outcome is now in your own country's politics.
Yeah, I heard the Right Honourable Minister, when he spoke here, talking this morning about the Caribbeans. Now, I don't know whether you realize that the 4 parties which were trying to get the new government are called in Germany the Jamaica coalition, because the colors of their parties are the same colors as you find in the national flag of Jamaica. That's the reason. So quite frankly, it's the first time in my life that I'm happy not to have to go to Jamaica. Because in this government, you had the Greens. And the reaction of the German stock exchange yesterday and today until this moment is, I think, speaking a good language. They don't like it, and I think that's okay. So don't worry. Germany is not in a crisis. Frau Merkel is in a crisis. Yeah, that's true. But that's a different issue. And the next thing will happen is we have a very strong constitution. We now have a president who has a very strong role, and we have 3 options, or he has 3 options. One is that we get back to this grand coalition which we had before. You know, this is like, from a Remainer, the option like no deal or deal. I mean, or the second is new elections, or the third one is a minority government. Quite frankly, I am unable to give you a prediction. But I only say, don't worry, Germany is a stable country, the economy runs well, the democracy is not in danger, and you look at what happened in Belgium or in the Netherlands or other countries, it takes sometimes months to come up with a new government. For us, it's something new, but don't worry.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I guess if anybody knows what's going on in my brain, it's Tim, actually, but there we are. Well, look, thank you, Tim, for that warm welcome. I couldn't agree more with everything you said, although I perhaps wouldn't stick with the landlord metaphor for Europe, but there we are. Now, it's great to see so many of you here in London and outside the Brussels bubble, the Brussels echo chamber. I want to talk to you today about the state of the negotiations and the critical role that the ECR, the European Parliament, and Conservative politicians on both sides of the channel can play in making Brexit work. But before we get on to talking about Brexit properly, I just want to say a word of thanks to the ECR and the work it's doing. As we negotiate our exit, the United Kingdom remains a European member, a European Union member, a full member. And until we leave, our citizens will be affected each and every day by the policies being discussed and voted on in Brussels. Luckily, they're represented by some of the finest and most public-spirited representatives this country has. It cannot be easy being a British MEP in Brussels right now. But whether it's Syed and Ashley's leadership role in Parliament, or David Nemmer's work promoting free and fair trade, or Amjad's work raising the persecution of the Rohingya people, It's clear to anyone who pays any attention at all that ECR MEPs are doing an outstanding job in standing up for Britain and its values. And that work is vital, because the European Parliament has an important role in the Brexit process. The Parliament, of course, has the right to scrutinise and vote on the deal that's negotiated. But equally, it has a role in influencing those negotiations by setting the context, the principles by which the European Union ranks its priorities. Now, I don't think it would be controversial for me to say I don't always agree with the European Parliament, but they have done an important job raising the issue of its citizens' rights with other institutions in Brussels. It's been clear from the start there could not be a more important issue for us, for the United Kingdom. I do not know a single person who voted to leave in the referendum who did so in order to undermine the rights that citizens enjoy. Not one. And I'm pleased with the progress we've made towards our single aim, giving both British citizens in the EU and European Union citizens in Britain the greatest possible certainty about their future. We've agreed to protect the rights of frontier workers, to protect the existing healthcare rights and arrangements of European Union citizens living in the United Kingdom and British citizens living across the European Union, to protect social security rights for those covered by the withdrawal agreement, including contributions made before and after we exit. And we've secured the right of British citizens in the EU 27 to set up and manage a business, and of course vice versa. And we're now in touching distance, that's the Prime Minister's phrase, in touching distance of an overarching agreement, one that will enable European citizens in the UK and Brits living across Europe to continue living their lives as they do now. Now, I know the title of this conference is Deal or No Deal, and I'll get to the no deal section of my speech shortly. But I do want to explain that I sit completely and unambiguously on the deal side of this particular equation, because reaching a deal with the European Union is not only by far and away the most likely outcome, it's also the best outcome for our country. A good deal will mean we can grasp the opportunities of an independent trade policy, while at the same time giving stability for our business and for the people they employ and for the economy that we support and upon which our prosperity depends. Now, as fellow politicians used to the cut and thrust of debate, you'll understand that Brexit talks have been tough and will continue to be so. Both sides have positions to defend and aims they're trying to achieve. Brexit may be an important democratic moment for the United Kingdom, but it's an unwished for and potentially serious disruption for the European Union. And indeed, as Tim was referring earlier, it's induced some attitudes that go with that, which we have to try and deal with and mitigate. The Commission and Parliament are naturally concerned about what Britain's exit will mean for the European project. Despite this, I'm confident we'll reach an outcome that works for the United Kingdom and that works for the European Union and the people, of course, that we all represent. Why? Well, because it's in the interests of both sides to do so. 3 million European Union citizens live in the United Kingdom, 1 million Brits live in the European Union. Billions of pounds of trade, hundreds of billions of pounds of trade are done every year between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Trade that supports millions of jobs across the continent. And achieving a deal that works for the United Kingdom and the European Union is the best way of ensuring continued prosperity right across Europe. Because while we're leaving the institutions of the European Union and taking back control of our laws, borders and money, we're not leaving Europe. And we want our closest neighbours, our friends and our allies to succeed, socially, politically, economically. Having a strong, united partner on our doorstep can only be a good thing for the United Kingdom. And it's in this spirit we've approached the negotiations with the European Commission. Behind the headlines that scream of deadlock and impasse, in reality, we've made real and tangible progress during talks so far. On top of the progress we've made on citizens' rights, as I've already mentioned, we've had constructive conversations about the unique circumstances of the Northern Ireland border and agreed joint principles on the common travel area so that people across the United Kingdom and Ireland can continue to live, work and study as freely across the two countries as they do now. Both sides are steadfast in their commitment to uphold the Good Friday Agreement in all its parts. And we agree that we want to avoid any physical infrastructure at the border, a hugely welcome move. On other issues, such as goods, union and member state procedures, privileges and immunities, ongoing confidentiality obligations, all those technical things that actually make the union work, we've reached agreement on the core issues. All of this technical detail will underpin the overarching deal that we want with the European Union. A new and deep and special partnership with our close neighbours, unwavering allies and committed trading partners. However, it's becoming clearer with each negotiating round that we now must start talking about our future relationship. The Northern Ireland border cannot be fully addressed if we're not taking into account the shape of our future partnership with the European Union. Final resolution of the financial settlement depends on it, because nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. That may be a familiar phrase to some of you. And the future of Europe requires a satisfactory resolution to the critical economic issues at stake. And we're ready to begin that conversation about the future partnership as soon as the European Union are. We have a clear vision, a bold and ambitious new relationship with our European friends, with a unique, comprehensive trade agreement at its heart that goes beyond anything the European Union has signed to date. Because after Brexit, Britain will be a third country partner like no other, much closer than Canada, much bigger than Norway, and uniquely integrated on everything from energy networks to services. Now I know that today you will discuss various models for the United Kingdom's future partnership. But here I think we need to be ambitious and challenge ourselves when we think about what agreement we can strike with the European Union. An agreement that's completely new, not a copy and paste of old deals, because we have already an unprecedented amount of cooperation with the Union. And the new partnership that we should strike with the European Union should reflect that. But we don't only need talks to move to the future relationship, but also to the implementation period we want after March 2019. We've made the importance of such a period very clear. Businesses need time to get their houses in order. And by the way, that's both British businesses and European businesses need time to get their houses in order, and should only have to prepare for one set of changes between the United Kingdom and the Union after Brexit. And that's as true for businesses in Europe who trade with us as it is for British companies. So during this implementation period, it's our view we should be able to access each other's markets on the same terms as we do now. Because that way, businesses get the confidence they need to make decisions and invest in an informed way, not by guessing what our future partnership with the European Union might look like. But I want to stress, this is not the United Kingdom staying in the European Union in perpetuity. We will be a third country and we will act as one too. That should mean the right to negotiate and sign free trade deals, so they can be enacted once the implementation period is over. We are clear that this transition period will have a strict time limit in accordance with the Prime Minister's double lock. That way, we can deliver on that historic referendum result and leave the European Union, but make sure that our exit is done in a smooth and orderly manner. Now, while I said I'm confident we can get a deal with the European Union, of course, the alternative is possible. Not probable, but it's possible that we don't get a deal. The department I run, DEXU for short, isn't called the Department for Getting a Deal come what may. It's the Department for Exiting the European Union. And whatever happens, we are leaving the European Union and delivering on the instruction of the British people. Now, I don't think it would be in the interests of either side for there to be no deal. When I sit across the table from Michel Barnier in Brussels, I know he is just as determined as I am to reach an agreement. But as a responsible government, it's right that we make every plan for every eventuality. So over the past year, every department across Whitehall has been working at pace, covering a whole range of scenarios. These plans have been well developed and have been designed to provide the flexibility to respond to a negotiated agreement, as well as preparing us for the chance that we leave without a deal. In Parliament, we're discussing the European Union withdrawal bill today, and that will ensure we have a fully functioning statute book on the day we leave, and will bring forward further legislation as required. We will also produce new systems and recruit new staff where necessary to ensure that we're ready in good time. Meanwhile, we are continuing to negotiate in good faith with the European Union, because I don't want a discussion about contingency planning to be interpreted as a sign that our negotiations with the European Union will fail, that we want them to fail, that there's a probability they'll fail. All of those are not true. This is a contingency planning exercise that a responsible government does, not a statement of any sort of intent or expectation. Now, as we look to the future partnership, we want the one we want with the European Union. I'm clear that with the backing and support of everyone in this room, we can achieve a deal that actually works for Britain and also for Europe, our strongest partners and friends. I have three simple objectives: short-term, medium-term and long-term. First, we must move the negotiations onto the future relationship. And for that reason, the December Council will be crucial. Then, we must use those talks to strike a deal that works for both sides and implement it smoothly. And finally, we must use Brexit for the betterment of Britain, delivering the change that our people voted for. There are no bystanders in this process. All of you in this room have a role to play. And everyone who wants these negotiations to succeed needs to work together to make it happen. So thank you for coming here today. The case for making progress in these talks is very clear, and so are our objectives. And I know that together you can help us to make them happen. So thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of your conference.
Let's say. Well, thank you very much, Tim, and I'm extremely pleased to be here at this important conference, which comes at a particularly important time, not least, of course, because of the proximity of the budget tomorrow. The British people made a very clear decision on the 23rd of June last year. They voted, just to remind you, to leave the European Union. And I think it's always important to revert to that one simple point in all the discussions that we have about the future of our country. We must always revert to the fact that on the 23rd of June 2016, 17.4 million British people voted to leave the European Union. Now, there's been an awful lot of agonizing analysis of what this actually meant, as if somebody was taking a chicken out and inspecting the entrails of the meaning of that vote. Well, looking at it very simply and straightforwardly, which is the way you have to analyze it, because the question, after all, was very simple and straightforward, was that the British people decided that they no longer wanted the United Kingdom to be bound by the EU treaties. And that is, in fact, reflected in the Article 50 process itself. The Article 50 text sets out the process for leaving the European Union, and it says that if a member state wishes to leave the EU, it will give notice to the Council, and there will then be a period of negotiation over withdrawal, and then when that negotiation is complete, or 2 years later, then the EU treaties will cease to apply to the member state in question. Now, in my book, that actually means that you are no longer there. You're out of it. You're no longer part of the single market. You're no longer part of the customs union. And I think most importantly of all, you are no longer subject to the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union. Now, that, it seems to me, is a very simple, straightforward proposition. And yet there are those who are in deep mourning about the referendum outcome, or who are in denial, who seek to interpret the referendum result in the way that best suits them. We've had these expressions, hard Brexit, soft Brexit. We once had, from a certain individual, a red, white and blue Brexit. But that same individual once set out the case with very great clarity, and she said, Brexit means Brexit. In other words, we voted to leave, so we do leave. I think it's important to step back and analyse the position that we find ourselves in now. The notice was served in March of this year, and therefore we have until the 29th of March 2019 to complete our process of negotiation or withdraw without a deal. We, I think, as a country, have always regarded the European Union as a free trade area. Joining the European community in the first place was, I believe, an extension of British economic policy that had prevailed for some 2 centuries. In other words, free trade. Free trade is part of our DNA. However, so far as the continuing EU is concerned, it, I believe, was never a purely economic project. In fact, it wasn't even chiefly an economic project. It was always, I believe, a political project that was founded in the history of the continent, which had been torn apart by 2 world wars in less than a century. So we've got 2 different views of the future of the European Union. And as we enter these negotiations, I believe that as a country we have to bear firmly in mind that what we are seeking to achieve, that is, a new free trade agreement, may well not be acceptable, sensible though that may be, to the continuing European Union. I speak with some experience of the European Union, having spent 12 months in the department for exiting it. I spoke repeatedly to EU foreign ministers, and the message I had repeatedly was, you must understand that that the UK cannot be seen to emerge from the process you've embarked upon in a position that is equivalent to being in the European Union. And the reason for that, of course, is very simple. If it were perceived in the European Union that we'd left on good, advantageous terms, then it might well be that other EU member states would want to follow our example and to strike out on their own themselves. So I think that in the current negotiations we should be under no illusions about the structural opposition that there is to our departure. We are seen at the moment, our departure is seen as an existential threat to the continuing European Union. We don't see it that way. We simply see it as a question of having exercised our right under the treaties to leave and wanting, very sensibly, to enter into a free trade agreement. But sadly, I think that there is resistance there. And I think that that resistance is highlighted by the fact that the negotiations we're currently involved in, which I remind you don't involve our trading relationship after we've left, don't mention that future relationship. And that is actually in contravention of Article 50 itself. Because Article 50 says quite clearly on the face of it that the negotiations over the terms of the withdrawal arrangement should be set against the future relationship of the departing member state and the European Union. It should take it into account. And yet, when the negotiating guidelines were set by the EU, there was no mention at all of the future relationship. And as a consequence of that, the continuing European Union is, I believe, quite deliberately pushing back the moment when those negotiations about the future trading relationship will have to begin. They've made it clear that they want 3 issues to be resolved in the first place. There's the issue of citizens' rights, there's the issue of the Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland border, and also, most importantly, I think from their point of view, there's the question of money. And until all those have been addressed, then they will not make further progress. Now, I think that we're arriving at a crucial point in the negotiations. The December Council will be the moment, I think, when we have to make a very, very solemn decision. And we have to decide whether we want to continue negotiating with the EU on the current terms, whether we want to continue, frankly, banging our head against the brick wall of the European Union's guidelines, or whether we want to say this, which is what I believe we should say. I think that we should indicate to the European Union that time is now becoming increasingly short. Michel Barnier himself indicated that he wanted to complete the entirety of the negotiations by October of next year, so that the terms of whatever agreement was concluded could be put to the various member states and could also be put to a vote of the European Parliament. We're less than 12 months away from that point. And what the EU, I believe, are trying to do by stringing along this process is to inculcate a sense of panic on the part of the United Kingdom, which frankly, in the case of certain of our politicians, is proving successful, that we may well be obliged to leave the European Union without a deal. In other words, we will crash out over the cliff edge, which are the usual expressions used to describe our departure. I actually believe that there is little to be feared from leaving the European Union and continuing to trade with it on WTO terms. Again, there is a strong misapprehension in this country that somehow the European Union can prevent British businesses from trading with them. Well, it overlooks the fact that business is conducted by business people. It isn't conducted by governments, it's conducted by business. And the rest of the world outside the European Union trades with the EU quite successfully on WTO terms. I dare say that there are very few people in this room who own a pair of trainers who will find when they go home this evening that those trainers are manufactured other than in India, China, or very possibly, exotically, Sri Lanka. In other words, it hasn't prevented the Chinese or the Indians or the Sri Lankans from penetrating the EU market and trading with them. The issue of regulation is constantly raised. We heard it from Michel Barnier yesterday. You must not depart from EU regulations. Well, the problem, of course, we have with the current arrangements is that a very small percentage of British businesses trade with the EU, yet 100% of British businesses are subject to EU regulations. Of course, if we want to trade with the European Union and we're not part of the single market, we will have to comply with EU regulations, such as when we trade with the United States, we comply with American regulations, or India with Indian regulations. But that does not mean that the entirety of the British economy has to be subject to the regulatory burden that emanates from Brussels simply because Brussels wants us to do so. So I don't frankly believe that we will see a terrific amount of progress at the European Council. I could be wrong, and it could be that they give some indication that the additional 20 billion or whatever it is we're offering them will be sufficient to start some sort of desultory negotiation. But I don't believe that it will be a serious negotiation about our future relationship. And as I say, time is now short. So I believe that we are now rapidly arriving at the point, indeed in only 3 weeks' time, where the message that the Prime Minister should be giving to the European Union is this: we want to trade with you on free trade terms. We are very happy and anxious to do so, and in fact you have already concluded the sort of agreement that we think is suitable for us with Canada in the course of the last few months. At the moment, we don't have the regulatory obstacles that Canada has because, of course, we're members of the EU already, and our regulations are in perfect, identical alignment with yours. So now is a good point to talk about that free trade agreement. But if you consider that we are still not far enough advanced with the preliminary negotiations, if we're still not offering you enough money, if for whatever reason you don't want to talk seriously to us about that future trading relationship, then we will assume that you will not be serious in the future. And we have other things to do. And therefore, we should now be suspending our negotiations with the European Union. We should be walking away from the conference room and starting to make preparations for life outside the EU. And that includes making sure that the necessary arrangements are put in place for customs, most particularly IT, most particularly port infrastructure, and of course the necessary personnel that we will need to ensure that those arrangements work satisfactorily. That's what we will be doing. If at some later stage you want to think better of it and you want to come back and talk to us about a free trade arrangement, then that's fine, please do. But just for now, we are not going to waste our and your time on negotiations that are clearly quite fruitless and which are being used by you quite disreputably in order to string out the process and put pressure on the United Kingdom. We keep hearing from business, quite properly, that what they need is certainty. Business hates uncertainty. Well, at the moment, they haven't got certainty. And frankly, we can't provide the sort of total certainty that they require because that requires buy-in from the European Union, which we haven't got. But what certainty we can provide you is this. On the day that we leave the European Union, whether it's with a deal or without a deal, whether it's a transitional arrangement or without one, we will have put in place the necessary customs arrangements to ensure that international trade is impeded as little as possible. And I think that that is the best service that the British government can do to the business community in this country. I think that we could arrive at a free trade agreement, but it will require a huge attitude adjustment on the part of the continuing European Union. And I think that the safest course to adopt is that that attitude will not be changed, that they will continue their obduracy, that they will continue to want to make an example of the United Kingdom, and ladies and gentlemen, we must not put up with that. So I believe that that's where we are. And I think that the prospect of trade on World Trade Organization terms is quite exciting. And I think the fact that it is rattling the European Union is that over the last couple of weeks we've been hearing all sorts of warnings about not creating Singapore on the banks of the River Thames. If that's the case, if they're really concerned about it, for goodness sake, talk to us. Otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that our answer is clear. We withdraw from the negotiations and we make our arrangements for a new future outside the European Union.
David has kindly agreed to take some questions, so in the usual way, gentlemen there at the back, we have got a microphone. Someone can, where's Ricky?
David, Steve Swinford at The Telegraph. We're hearing overnight that the Prime Minister has agreed broadly to pay more money and to secure a breakthrough in the deadlock in negotiations, and also there's a possibility that the ECJ could have some kind of jurisdiction over the rights of EU citizens, which was previously a red line. Are these a red line for you still?
I think certainly so far as the European Court of Justice is concerned, yes, it is a red line. The fact is that the ECJ is the sovereign body of the European Union. It has the capacity to overturn British treaties, and it has in the past. And I don't think that we could regard ourselves as an independent sovereign nation if in fact we were to be subject in any way to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. The EU doesn't require the ECJ to have sovereignty in terms of the rights of its citizens resident, for example, in the United States, which of course is a third country. When we're a third country, then it should have no sovereignty here either. Can I also say, in terms of the money, I think it'll be interesting to see what the response of the EU is to that. As I understand it, it's made absolutely clear, it will be made absolutely clear by the government that the payment of any further sums of that nature will be subject to there being an agreement as to our future relationship. I'm heartened by the fact that the mantra of the EU is always nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and so therefore I hope that they will listen to their own strictures, and perhaps that will encourage them to talk to us sensibly.
Gentleman again at the back.
Hi, thanks. Peter Walker from The Guardian. You were slightly more circumspect about your no-deal views when you were in ministerial office. Now you're liberated. You take a slightly different view. How sympathetic do you think DexEU is, both in terms of the ministers and civil servants, to this idea of having to potentially walk away?
Can I say, yes, I am liberated. Not being a minister has huge compensations, and I'm enjoying them at the moment by addressing you here today. So far as DexEU is concerned, look, I can no longer speak for them. You will have to speak to DexEU, you'll have to speak to the ministers, and I wouldn't presume to speak on their behalf. It wouldn't be the right thing to do.
John Strafford. My experience as a businessman is that, and I've traded with my own company throughout the world over 40 years, is that you have to demonstrate that you're prepared to walk away. And you have done a brilliant speech today, which I agree with 100%. But my experience is that if the two parties want to do a deal, when you show that you're going to walk away, the other party comes back to you pretty quickly. Now, if that happened, and we followed your line, and they came back to you, what would you do then?
Well, I think that we should talk to them, because if there's any hope of the sort of free trade agreement that the Prime Minister says she wants, we should pursue every avenue to try to achieve that. But, you know, you're absolutely right. If you take, for example, the Labour Party's position, it's a bit like the man who walks into a car sales room and says to the salesman, look, I want a new car, and I don't care how much I pay for it. I'm insisting upon buying it. You're right. You can't enter a negotiation of any sort unless you make it absolutely clear that there will come a point when you will walk away. My own feeling is that we're arriving at the point where the EU is not really negotiating seriously, and we should therefore, at this particular moment, suspend our participation in the negotiations and tell them, when you're ready to talk sensibly, we'll come back.
On the front row, please.
Thank you. Jonathan Bullock. I'm a UKIP MEP for the East Midlands. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I tweeted exactly what you said just after David Davis spoke. I don't know if you were reading my tweets, but the point is about the ECJ. If it's a red line for you, and I agree it should be, if a deal comes back to the House of Commons which has that in, will you be prepared to vote against the deal?
Put it this way, I can't think that I and a large number of my colleagues would countenance any arrangement where the European Court of Justice had indefinite jurisdiction in this country. I think that it would be completely unacceptable, and I can't think that anyone, at least certainly from large tranches of the Conservative Party, would agree with that.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Thank you. Anthony McKay from Hemel Hempstead Conservative Association. Isn't the part of the problem with the negotiation that we appear to be negotiating with a French monkey as opposed to the organ grinder?
I think that the organ grinder has got a few political problems of her own at the moment. And frankly, may I say, in all seriousness, I think that this is a huge problem. That is the fact that so many EU countries are in complete disarray. Germany is in the middle of its biggest political crisis, apparently, since the last war. We've got Spain, which is concerned about the issue of Catalonia. We've got Italy with a very weak economy, and a whole host of other countries that have got their own issues. And I think that until such time as they start resolving their own problems and they're not so distracted by them, the current state of affairs will prevail. And we simply can't run the risk of allowing these talks to drag on and to take no action to preserve our own position. We've got to make arrangements now for life outside the EU, even if, as we all hope, we will have an FTA at the end of the process.
What's the timings, David, in terms of assuming the British government pursues a deal, it could collapse very late in the process. You talked earlier about the ratification having to begin in the autumn of next year. We could be faced with a no-deal scenario 3 months before we drop out, even closer.
Well, you're absolutely right, Tim, and of course this is another very
Just
good,
because of one
good
parliament,
reason.
perhaps in Europe.
One parliament. I remember sitting in a conference room in Luxembourg for hours on end, waiting with a lot of other EU foreign ministers for Wallonia to decide whether or not it wanted to ratify the Canadian CETA treaty. And in the end, we all gave up and went home. And as I was walking out of the room, I heard one foreign minister saying to another, where exactly is Wallonia anyway? So that is a problem. But of course, the other problem, and a major problem, is the issue of the European Parliament. The European Parliament has got to ratify whatever is agreed. And frankly, given the bellicose noises that are being made by a lot of MEPs, we can't take that for granted either. So I think that in terms of offering reassurance to British businesses, we need to be making arrangements now. And that is why I think that the Chancellor tomorrow should be announcing that he's setting aside the necessary funds to make sure that our customs arrangements work perfectly on our day of departure.
If you could allocate a percentage to how much of the 100% you'd like the British government to be devoting to being ready for no deal, how much resource and how much wherewithal is being put to this?
I think that the British government should be doing everything that is necessary to ensure that that system works properly.
I know you do, but what percentage are they giving to this at the moment?
Well, I think they should be giving 100%, certainly. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
You're not going to answer my question.
Well, I'll do my best, but I can only go so far.
I have 2 final questions, there and Richard at the back. The lady there.
Sarah Macken. If I'm slightly more optimistic for a moment, and think perhaps the 14th and 15th of December might lead to a positive outcome and a movement on the negotiations, do you think that perhaps the UK government could be more proactive in setting out its position, the position that it wants? So there's been quite a lot of discussion here this morning on CETA, various different models. Is there any sense that in government they're drafting the UK's preferred outcome? And if not, should it be doing that?
Well, the Prime Minister made the position very clear. She said she wanted a very deep and ambitious free trade agreement. I think that CETA was a very good example. And I think that CETA, maybe CETA Plus, would be something that we should be pursuing. But what I wouldn't want to see is any arrangement that constrained the United Kingdom in its ability to trade with the rest of the world. And I think that the importance is that we should have the sort of arrangement that the EU is entirely happy to sign with third countries, such as Canada, the one that they're talking about in terms of Japan. I think frankly, CETA would suit our requirements. But at the moment, and if you hear the noises that Michel Barnier made only yesterday, it seems very clear to me that they're going to want to exercise the degree of control over our regulations that they haven't asked the Canadians for. Well, I mean, that is utterly illogical. We're going to be a third country. And I think that they've got this idea that after our departure, we will be a sort of satellite orbiting the European Union. Well, we won't. We will be a free, independent country, trading with the rest of the world and trading, I hope, on good terms with the European Union. And that's why I'm concerned and frankly pessimistic as to the prospects of coming up with the sort of solution that we want. I don't think that there is the willingness there on the EU part. I think, as I said earlier, that politics is coming into it, and what they are seeking to achieve is something that demonstrates that the integrity of the EU 27 is inviolable, and that what we're proposing is something that should never be repeated.
Final question, Richard at the back. Just introduce yourself.
Sorry, this is the follow-up question. I'm Richard Patient, a small businessman. I suppose you would have heard David Davis's question, or his speech. He said that the UK would be uniquely integrated with the EU. Does that mean that he wants the UK to have regulated convergence, or does it mean that we're going to have one where we diverge and we have deregulation?
Well, I think you should have asked him that question when he was in the room, because, I mean, sadly, I didn't hear what he had to say. I wasn't here. I was sitting in a committee in Portcullis House. So I've dashed over here, and I don't know. I can't answer for David Davis, I'm sorry.
Just so we've got that time, the lady, you had a question, didn't you, there, just very briefly.
Alexandra Phillips, political consultant and former head of media for UKIP. This is quite a complicated question, I apologise, but...
Not too complicated, please.
Not too complicated. I've actually got written confirmation from Jean-Claude Juncker that he is well aware that a transitional agreement cannot come under Article 50, given that a transitional agreement involves trade negotiations and therefore comes under Article 218. Given that Article 218 is only activated once we are a third country, does it therefore not make it legally implausible that there can be any transitional period, given that that would require reopening the treaties themselves to essentially tinker with the articles governing this?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's a really good question. I think that you've identified one of the myriad of legal difficulties that we have in approaching the issue of transition. At the moment, frankly, it's very hard to understand what transition means. And the reason it's hard to understand is because we're the only ones who are really talking seriously about transition at all. But it's clear that there would have to be a treaty change or a new treaty. And as you rightly say, that sort of treaty could only actually take effect once we are actually a third country. So there might well be a hiatus. Whether that hiatus is for a nanosecond or longer remains to be seen, and that would be something we'd have to discuss. My perception is that there is a huge amount of resistance on the part of the EU to overcome, and at the moment, I'm doubtful as to whether it will be overcome.
So can I just clarify, you therefore think that it's unlikely that there could even be a transitional period to get to the crux of the matter, and whether that's just sort of political...
No, I think that once we go beyond the transitional period, we would then need a new treaty. I think that so far as the transition itself is concerned, it's an interesting question. If that could be incorporated into the withdrawal agreement, then it's possible that we could continue on current terms. My own feeling, and you know, you've got an expert QC sitting behind you, so you should be speaking to him. My own feeling, however, is frankly, and it has been for some time, is that this really can only be resolved by treaty. And, you know, no doubt Mr. Howe will be pleased to enlighten you further immediately after this meeting.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. Seeing Martin Howe in the audience, we've got so many